Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another 40k lore video. Today, as promised, we will be looking at Titan weaponry and defenses. Now, before we get to the weaponry, we need to start out with defenses, namely Void Shields, because I will be referring to Void Shields a few times in the weapons section, so it's best if you know what it is before I start going on about it. A Void Shield is a special form of gravitic or electrically charged energy field employed by the Imperium of Man. It is based directly on warp technology, and it is not entirely certain how it operates. All we know is that it provides its defensive capabilities by dissipating energy, which essentially means that if a las beam, for example, were to strike it, the shield will try to take the energy in the las beam and dissipate it across its surface. The same with kinetic rounds, they take the kinetic energy and dissipate it across the shield. Now, how exactly this is done is, as I said, unclear. We don't know whether the shield itself somehow steals the energy from the projectile, or the laser bolt, or if it somehow transports minute portions of the energy very, very quickly over into the warp. This is warp-based technology after all, so it's not completely beyond the realms of possibilities. We do know also, however, that there is a limit to how much energy this shield can dissipate. When the energy shield is spent, so to say, it is automatically turned off. The Prncipe of a Titan, for example, can force the shield to stay up for longer, but this puts enormous strain on the shield generator and runs the risk of causing a catastrophic malfunction. In the best case scenario, this will simply blow out some of the delicate machinery and electronics within the generator, or in the worst case scenario, the whole thing will go boom, with predictably uncomfortable consequences, considering the amount of flammable material that such a thing is usually surrounded by. Wiring, etc., fuel cells, la-ba-di-la, not to mention the possibility of a plasma generator being nearby. And the amount of damage, so to say, that such a shield can dissipate is dependent entirely upon the generator, the type of the generator, and the number of generators that is located in so-called a bank of generators. The standard for the smallest Titan, a Warhound Titan, is one generator of two smaller generators, e.g. one bank of generators that generate two relatively small Void Shields. Larger Titans can either have several large single generators or several banks of Void Shield generators. The difference between a single shield and a bank is that a single shield is usually far stronger, as it is focusing all its power into a single shield, but once it collapses, there's nothing behind it. Whereas as a shield bank, when one shield collapses, the other one immediately steps in and takes over the strain, hopefully then holding up for long enough for the other shield to be recharged, and there you just go on and on and on and on, essentially. Well, that's the hope, at least. And there are also different classes of shield generators. For example, the Void Shield generators located on spaceships are considerably more potent than those mounted even on Titans. And Void Shield generators designed specifically to defend fortifications or important strategic areas like Hive cities or military bases are of a completely different scale again. Some of the most powerful Void Shield generators in the Imperium are usually located in strategic areas on planets because of the ridiculous amount of energy that such a generator requires. It is only really feasible to have it located on a planet because of the sheer size of the damn thing. Putting this thing on a spaceship would be like putting a gigantic bleeping weak spot on the thing, seeing as a spaceship could probably get bombarded from several directions and take a lot more firepower. A Void Shield generator on a planet, however, well, you're somewhat limited in how many angles you can fire at something on a planet. At the very least, you can only fire from above and at certain angles before running the risk of hitting friendly ships, etc. Anyways, back to the point. These Void Shield generators are powerful enough to stand up to bombardments from orbits. Some of them are even capable of standing up to some of the largest warships in the Imperium's arsenal, sporting dozens of lance cannons and innumerable bombardment weaponry. These shields are fairly rare and maintained with extreme reverence by the Adeptus Mechanicus, as there is no longer the technology available to build one of these massive generators. The smaller ones can still be produced, and indeed even the ones built on Emperor Titans can still be produced, but the venerable Void Shield generators that is located in the Imperial Palace, for example, the art of creating such magnificently powerful defenses has been lost to the Imperium for a while, and even those are mere shadows of the ones that originally defended the Imperial Palace, and even those were actually destroyed during the Horus Heresy, so the sheer amount of firepower that is available on the battlefields of the 41st millennium, or, well, in that case the 30th millennium, were quite apocalyptic. But enough about that. There is one last thing we need to mention before moving on to the weapons, and then we're done with the Void Shield generators. It is the fact that they are not only capable of dissipating energy extremely well, they also have a rather nasty reaction to itself. You see, a Void Shield could be likened to a cage of wires spinning around a model, spinning around a sphere of wires, essentially. Trying to, make a mental picture here to explain. Like a waveform radiation that is located around a nexus. It spins so fast that there's no way you can, insert a finger or a foreign object in through it without impacting upon the field. But the thing is, when you have multiple fields going at the same time, as in the case of some of the larger Titans or spaceships, if these shields were ever to touch, the results would be catastrophic. Essentially, what happens is that when two Void Shields overlap and hit each other, they start transferring energy between each other, and therefore they start trying to absorb and dissipate said energy. This will usually lead to the capacity of the Void Shields being overloaded extremely quickly. In fact, it can happen so quickly that the generator's failsafe is simply not capable of kicking in fast enough, and to withstand the ridiculous amount of energy that it is asked to stop. This will almost certainly cause a major malfunction within the Void Shield generator. Best case scenario, it only gets heavily damaged. Worst case scenario, it just flat out explodes and, in all due likelihood, severely injures or even just flat out cripples or even just destroys whatever it is mounted on. Now, there is, however, a strategic use for this, or a tactical use, technically. You see, if one Titan has a considerably stronger Void Shield than the other Titan, he can use its Void Shield to overload the other Titan's Void Shield. It's still an extremely risky maneuver, because, well, the differences here are very, very minute. Even the most powerful shield in existence and the weakest shield in existence, the difference between one of them blowing out and both of them blowing out is only a few seconds of contact, which means that it is a very, very risky maneuver, and additionally, of course, Void Shields are never completely guaranteed to be of a certain strength. They fluctuate. Now, this is virtually unnoticeable under fire from, infantry weapons or even anti-Void Shield weapons. These differences are very, very minute indeed, but when two Void Shields overlap, it could make the difference of 1 or 2 seconds perhaps, which could be fatal for either side or fatal for both sides. Because what is most likely to happen is that both shields collapse. And, well, what happens when both shields collapse? Well, this means that both Void Shields fail to dissipate the energy of the other Void Shield, which means that now the entire energy quantity within both of these shields will explode outwards, at the same time hitting each other, rebounding, and more than likely tearing to tiny, tiny pieces whatever the shields were located on. Essentially, it would be like detonating a nuke between the two shields. It is rather uncomfortable for anyone within earshot, let's just say. Nevertheless, some particularly crazy, or some would say brave, Principes and starship captains have in fact tried to pull this off, and some have even succeeded without getting their machine blown to bits, which is certainly something to be applauded. It has even become something of a strategy for void captains. In most cases, an enemy ship's shields would have to be stripped away before any kind of ram could be carried out, and ramming is a perfectly legit tactic in Void Warfare in 40k for some factions, where the prow of the ship is so ridiculously heavily armoured, as it is of course designed to withstand enemy fire, that it is more than capable of withstanding an impact with another starship. Some captains have taken this one step further, and have installed special heavy shield generators located around the front part of the ship, the prow. And essentially, what they hope is that these shield generators will impact with the enemy shield generators and start blowing out his shields one by one. The gamble here, of course, is that the attacking ship will have either enough generators or powerful enough generators to survive the process while stripping away all the shields of the enemy ship, thereby allowing their own shields to impact upon the enemy's ship. Now, a shield has very little effect upon a relatively slow-moving object. However, a starship is not a slow-moving object, and one starship ramming another starship, oh, that is a considerable amount of speed, velocity, and kinetic force we're talking about here, which can often lead to the ship's shields ripping through the opponent. And even if that alone does not cause crippling damage to the enemy ships, it will strip away armor plating, and then a hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of tons starship will impact on it, with predictable consequences. Not the safest strategy in the Imperial Admiralty's handbook, but certainly an effective one. And now we get to the good stuff. We'll start out with so-called Scout Titan weaponry, the lightest of the two official classifications, and though the two classifications have some subcategories again, broadly speaking, Titan weaponry can be divided into two classes: Scout Titan weaponry and Battle Titan weaponry. So, we'll start with the Scout stuff, with the Inferno Cannon. The Inferno Cannon is, well, you can kind of tell by looking, can't you? It is a massive flamethrower that fires the so-called Promethium, a petroleum-like jelly that sticks to targets, and is quite similar to our current-day napalm. It's not quite the same thing, but the comparison is close enough for government work, so you may call it napalm. Now, the obvious question is, why would you bother mounting a flamethrower on a Titan, even if it is just a Warhound Titan? Wouldn't a vehicle like that have better things to do than just, screw around with infantry and fire? Well, in many cases you would be correct, but you must also remember that the Warhammer 41st Millennium's universe has a ton of absolutely ludicrously massive hive cities that are more than big enough to carry several Titans, even of the larger types, through its streets. This is essentially one city, built upon another city, built upon another city, built upon another city, and built upon another city, etc., until you reach a few kilometers up into the skies. This kind of urban combat is not particularly gentle, let's just say, and as such, a massive, super heavily armored, void-shielded Titan carrying triple flamethrowers on his arm could potentially be quite useful in persuading the enemy to stop hiding like cowards in buildings and metal boxes. The obvious drawback, however, is of course that it doesn't have much in the way of anti-Titan or anti-armor firepower. Against some of the more primitive races, it might be relatively decent at dealing with armor, providing it gets close enough. For example, the Orcs are not particularly big on quality engineering and air conditioning, so if you manage to heat up the tank enough, the dudes inside will eventually keel over dead. Imperial tanks, somewhat more problematic. I mean, if you keep dousing them for long enough, eventually they too will boil, but you won't be able to take a shortcut by igniting their engine, as you would be able to do with an Orc tank. And sure, if you manage to somehow catch a Falcon and Elder anti-grav tank in a proper hit of, triple-linked Promethium Gullop, yeah, it'll probably fuck it over, but it's somewhat unlikely. And for Titans, well, yeah, this isn't going to do much to a Titan. In fact, it's not even particularly good at overloading Void Shields, that the heat generated from even a triple flamethrower like this is not particularly good at overloading Void Shields. But when it comes to flushing infantry out of heavily entrenched positions or urban environments, well, there really is no competition, is it? It's a gigantic flamethrower. Hell, the cool factor alone makes this a valid weapon in my opinion. But if you would prefer something a little bit more conventional, there is of course the Vulcan Mega Balsa. This is a somewhat massive, pneumatically driven 5-barrel air-cooled, electrically fired rotary bolt weapon. Essentially a massive version of Astartes bolt guns, firing gigantic high-explosive shells the size of a human's head. The Vulcan Mega Bolter is very, very good indeed at killing large numbers of infantry. First and foremost, simply because, well, those are some very, very large bullets it's firing, and secondly, they explode, which also makes them pretty damn effective, and it fires a lot of them. Now, in most conflicts, something like this would be considered somewhat wasteful as well. You can fire 1,000 rounds into a trench and you'll probably kill, what, 10, 20 people if you get lucky? But a horde of orcs, on the other hand, oh, yes! Now that is bang for your buck, most definitively. And it is even capable of inflicting reasonable damage on light to medium heavily armoured vehicles. Light armoured vehicles will eventually be penetrated by the sheer deluge of shells, and even medium heavy vehicles could potentially get destroyed simply because, well, there's so many shells that they will eventually just hammer the vehicle to pieces through the sheer high explosive nonsense they are capable of. Super heavy tanks are fairly immune to it, however, and most Titan armor is also fairly proof against the Vulcan Megabolter, but should it hit something particularly vital, like for example the Commander's Bridge, or a joint, or perhaps get really lucky and have a shell strike a weak point into a magazine or something, it can certainly do damage, but primarily the Vulcan Megabolter is used to overload Void Shields. You see, a single bolt is no challenge whatsoever to a Void Shield. Its energy will be dissipated harmlessly and will simply just fall to the ground, not really doing, well, anything, really. However, 10,000 bolt rounds? Different story. So it is extremely good at overloading shields, essentially just by delivering thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kinetic impacts to a shield in a very, very, very brief space of time. A shield, of course, is capable of regenerating slowly over time, which is why a weapon that's like this, that hits so fast, is ideal for overloading it, because something heavier, like a plasma weapon, might hit it once, not quite manage to overload it, and then have to have another shot again, maybe again fail to quite overload it, so a rapid-firing weapon is usually superior in this case. However, the Vulcan Megabolter does produce a rather considerable amount of heat when fired, which means it has a bit of a time limit to just how long it can operate continuously without some rather serious problems. The ammunition feed in and of itself is not that big of an issue, as this is a very, very well supplied system. Warhound Titans usually carry enough ammunition for pretty much any single battle for a day or so. Larger Titans can carry enough ammunition for several days of sustained engagement, and certainly it can keep firing for a very long time. It's just, if you keep continuously firing, it's going to get very, very warm, and that leads to all kinds of problems like barrel warpage, etc. Now, the rotating barrel system, of course, solves a few of these problems, but the sheer heat is still not entirely safe to deal with. Of course, there's also the additional problem that the weapon itself heats up the weapon compartments, which could very easily foul the quite complicated loading mechanism. So, most Titans will only fire these weapons for relatively short periods of time, and rather fire continuous bursts relatively often. There's also a slight problem, of course, that the loading system is extremely complicated and extremely reliable. It doesn't jam much, let's just say. There are also tech priests permanently stationed within the weapon in case it should jam, but that doesn't happen very often. But should it jam? Well, it is an extremely complicated mechanism, and those are massive, massive rounds. And so clearing a jam, should it happen, is quite a lot of work, requiring quite a lot of specialized equipment, so it's not something you want to actually have happen. And to avoid this, the weapon itself is usually crewed by one or more engine seers and one or more Adeptus Mechanicus priests. There's always one, however, present to continuously evoke the litanies of reloading and redemption to make sure that the weapon's machine spirit stays happy-dappy and, you know, gladly murdering things instead of going, you know, I don't want to do this anymore, I didn't have my lollipop today, so fuck you, I'm going to jam now. And you wouldn't want that now, would you? But perhaps that's a little bit too conventional for you again, so what about the Turbo Laser Destructor? Yes, I know, that is quite the mouthful. The Turbo Laser Destructor, just going to be called the Destructor from now on, is a much, much larger and more powerful version of a las cannon that uses a complex optical device and heavy power input to amplify the laser beam into a wider, enhanced beam of energy. This energy beam carries with it enough oomph to explosively vaporize whatever it impacts upon, making it a pretty goddamn fine anti-tank weapon, as you might imagine, and having two of them on a single chassis is even better. There are in fact a few variations on it. There's a single-barreled version that is often mounted on some patterns of Adeptus Astartes Thunderhawk gunships. There's a double-barreled version, usually carried by Warhound Titans or Reaver-class Titans, even some on Warlord-class Titans, though more usually Warlord-class Titans will be carrying the triple-barreled version. And to give you a general impression of the amount of firepower that an Imperator-class Titan can bring to bear, for it, this weapon is merely just a secondary. It's a shoulder-mounted optional weapon. It's not a main weapon, it's just, you know, something we threw on for the sake of looks, you know? And it is a remarkably good-looking weapon as well as being somewhat effective, let's just say. And this weapon is most definitively a Titan killer. It's going to have trouble getting through void shields, multiple layers of which anyways, as one hit from a single barrel is probably not enough to breach a void shield. 2 hits, perhaps, 3 hits almost certainly, but a single hit to a Titan is unlikely to do catastrophic damage unless they get a really good hit on the commander's bridge, as the Titans of course are not only armoured with void shields, they also carry around an absolute metric arse-ton of conventional armor plating. However, when engaging light, medium, or even heavy and super heavy vehicles, the Laser Destructor is remarkably effective, as not only is it capable of course of melting armor plating, but it is almost guaranteed to kill whatever is inside the vehicle when the armor plating explosively vaporize. It also has a reasonable rate of fire to boot, making it a fantastic weapon to engage large numbers of medium armor, tank columns, that kind of stuff. It should most of the time be reserved for this use rather than Titan hunting. It can hunt Titans potentially, and it can be absolutely devastating to lighter Titans like Warhounds, but you probably want something a little bit more persuasive if you're going to be taking on something along the lines of a Reaver or a Warlord, never mind an Imperator. And even super heavy tanks can prove a bit of a challenge to this weapon, especially the few variants of super heavies who come with void shields can prove quite tough indeed. But for its primary task, it is a damn effective weapon, and it is certainly more accurate than its compatriot in anti-armor warfare, namely the Plasma Blast Gun. Now, the Plasma Blast Gun is essentially an absolutely massive plasma weapon. In fact, it is the largest plasma cannon in existence. It is usually mounted on Imperial Guard super heavy Stormblade tanks and it's somewhat rarer on Titans due to the amount of maintenance and supervision that is required to keep the gun operating, but when mounted in this position it is a very effective anti-tank and anti-infantry weapon. It is very, very, very versatile, as of course it fires globulets of superheated plasma that splash over a wide area. Unprotected infantry is not going to be surviving just because the Titan missed them, unless it missed by something along the lines of a good 50 meters. And it's equally effective against tanks because, again, this is superheated plasma. It doesn't actually need to hit a tank to do massive damage, just splashing it will be plenty. Now, the weapon is designed to fire in two modes. It has a blast mode, where both barrels are fired at once. This is usually used either to overload void shields, or to deal with super heavy tanks, or to attempt to deliver the finishing blow to an enemy Titan. The rest of the time, the weapon is usually kept in rapid fire mode, and while there is nothing particularly rapid about the rate of fire of a plasma blast gun, it is certainly a hell of a lot more rapid than the burst mode, because a plasma weapon takes a considerable amount of time to recharge when it has been discharged. This is helped in rapid fire mode by only discharging half of the weapon's energy at a time, allowing it to, well, restock, so to say, a bit quicker. But, of course, if you're dealing with multiple enemies, as in the case of attacking an armoured column, you probably want to fire multiple times rather than firing one large shot, in which you'll probably hit, what, 2, 3, 4 tanks perhaps if you're lucky, whilst if you keep it in rapid fire, you can relatively quickly disable numerous enemy tanks. And now we get to the Battle Titan weaponry. And we will start out in style with the Gatling Blaster. This is the Mega Bolter's very, very large cousin. This thing is not technically a bolt weapon. However, it fires what is essentially tank shells. It is a Gatling weapon that fires ammunition normally reserved for super heavy battle tanks, and it does so very, very quickly. In fact, it fired its rounds so quickly that the original design was somewhat problematic because the Titan just couldn't carry enough ammunition for it. So they modified the Reaver-class Titan that would carry them to have additional ammo hoopers to help alleviate the problem. The next problem was somewhat more, well, hilarious, frankly. You see, to begin with, the Gatling Blaster had a very standard ejection system for its spent cartridges. The ejected cases were simply just fired out the side of the weapon, as with a rifle, for example. Now, this became somewhat problematic because, you see, the rounds themselves are of course very, very large, which means that the cartridges are very, very large. This meant that the ejection system caused a foreign object damage hazard for supporting ground troops. Literally, the giant-ass cartridges had a nasty habit of simply just smashing supporting battle tanks and crushing infantry, which was eventually considered to be somewhat hazardous and counterproductive, as of course these Titans would normally rely on a little bit of protection so that they wouldn't have to deal with all of the infantry swarming over them. The solution to this was simple yet elegant. They introduced a double-ended ejection system, whereas the spent casing was simply just reloaded into the magazine in the last slot. Now, this has an additional interesting effect. By sheer weight of ammunition, should the Reaver Titan expend all of its casings and have them fired out to the side of the weapon, it would unbalance the Titan, as it would move its center of gravity a rather considerable amount, and while the spent shell casing cannot completely alleviate for this problem, it makes it a hell of a lot smaller than if the entire casing should be ejected. As for the gun itself, it is primarily considered an anti-tank weapon due to the sheer scale of ammunition it fires, but it also fires high explosive ammunition, and is so, while you would normally consider using something like this on infantry to be the grossest form of overkill, it can certainly get the job done, and against stuff like Tyranid swarms or orc hordes, you know, firing something like this might seem like a somewhat extreme action, but, well, if there's a million orcs rushing you, then, yeah, might as well kick in the Gatling Blaster, because, well, there's sure enough of them to fire at. But primarily, in more civilized conflict, it is reserved for use against armoured vehicles, as, while a single shell might not be enough to knock out an armoured vehicle, 2 or 3 or, well, for example, I don't know, 1,000 per minute is probably enough to deal with quite a few armoured vehicles. Hell, with this caliber of shell, it doesn't even really need to hit them. As long as they hit close by, they'll probably flip the thing over. And also, while not classified as a Titan killer, it is certainly capable of doing considerable damage to a Titan as long as it can get behind it or its side where there is less armor, and it is more than able to overload Voyage shield generators. At the very least, of equal scale Titans, Reavers and Warlords, etc. It has also often been used as an effective long-range bombardment platform to attack enemy fortifications. Essentially, the Reaver elevates its barrel and uses its vast array of cogitators and advanced targeting systems to calculate the trajectory needed to lob shells onto enemy defences, and since this gun fires thousands of rounds at a time, and each of these rounds is equal to that of a super heavy battle cannon, you can imagine that it will be rather effective at convincing the enemy to perhaps stay inside of their bunkers for just a little longer. But perhaps this is a little bit too weak for you. Perhaps we should try and go a little bit grander. Perhaps we need a Hellstorm Cannon. And before you ask, yes, that is a mountaintop there in the foreground. Those are some bloody big guns. This, however, is not a projectile weapon, despite it that it might look like another rotary cannon. It is in fact a direct energy weapon. Well, you could kind of compare this to a laser cannon, but it would be pretty much like comparing a rabbit to a bear. There are some vague similarities that are both fluffy, but that's about it. And those of you who played Dawn of War Dark Crusade might recognize this weapon from the finest mission on Kronos, where you can actually charge and fire this beautiful, beautiful thing. And you might have noticed that there was a massive trench dug out in front of it from its final firing. This is a remarkably powerful weapon, capable of reducing entire armies in single cataclysmic salvos, and it is even capable of stripping the Voyage shields from a Warlord-class Titan in a single volley. Now, a weapon this powerful is what you would normally classify as a Titan killer, or at the very least a Titan hurter, and is usually only mounted on Imperator-class Titans or Warlord-class Titans. This is a very, very heavy weapon indeed, and there's not a whole lot of them still around in the Imperium of Man, but those there are still reaping a rather fearsome toll amongst the Imperium's enemies. And this, I think, is what most people would think of when they think Titan-class weaponry, these massive gargantuan weapons capable of levelling literally cities in single volleys, capable of reducing mountains with sustained firepower. The sheer, unbridled, destructive capabilities of this weapon is one of the many, many reasons that I dearly adore and love 40k. But, of course, you might have been noticing from the previous video that pretty much all Titans carried, of course, 2 weapons, and they were usually different types of weapons. Now, you might have been wondering why this is, and since this is the weapons video, this is a good time to touch a little bit upon that. You see, in most cases, Titans carry a variety of weapons to allow them to be a little bit flexible in most scenarios, but primarily, at least in the case of heavier Titans like Reavers, Warlords, etc., they will carry one weapon that is meant to strip the shields of enemy Titans, generally something with a high rate of fire or capable of delivering a single extremely high energy sustained attack. Now, there's not a whole lot of that latter type of weapons, it's pretty much only the Plasma Annihilator capable of that kind of sheer damage output, but we'll get to that in a bit. So, like I said, one rapid firing weapon to take care of enemy infantry or lightly armoured vehicles, and of course, the main reason, to take out void shields. And then it carries one proper punch weaponry, the Titan killing weaponry. This is the one that is designed to deal with other Titans. The combination is pretty damn obvious. The rapid firing weapon strips the Titan of its primary protection, being the void shields, and the Titan killer then finishes the job with a directed shot to a weak point, like a weapon for example, or the commander's bridge, or the Titan's midsection, or perhaps one of its legs to force it to topple over, stuff like that. Now, these Titan killing weapons are usually defined in that they will deliver a massive amount of damage in 1 or 2 hits, as quickly as possible essentially, because once you've overloaded the enemy's void shield, he is of course almost certainly returning fire, which means that you have a fairly short window of time with which to kill him before he kills you. And the next weapon, the Meltzer Cannon, is a wonderful example of this. This beautiful little thing is essentially and technically another gargantuan flamethrower, except it works from a slightly different principle. You see, instead of flames, this reuses so-called Meltzer technology to create plasma rather than just good old-fashioned promethium or napalm. It works by submolecular thermal agitation. What this essentially means in layman's terms is it causes extreme heat, causing the molecules of whatever it hits to agitate, to start moving, to fall apart, to disintegrate, essentially evaporate. This, of course, is quite effective against armor because, well, it'll essentially just melt away. And against infantry, oh, it is a gruesome damn weapon, but at least you won't feel anything. You see, the intense heat created from this weapon will not burn you to death. It will instantly evaporate living tissue as all moisture vaporizes explosively. Your very blood will explode, so you won't have time to feel anything. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're not going to be living onwards afterwards. That's unfortunately somewhat more than a flesh wound, I'm afraid. But against other Titans, it is a remarkably effective weapon as long as its primary disadvantage can be overcome. You see, despite the fact that virtually no armor is defense against this weapon, it is also extremely short range. A concentrated blast of plasma, in this case heavily condensed heat plasma, is not a very good long-range weapon, because the longer it has to travel, the more energy and the more heat it loses, and it doesn't have to travel very long before it is no longer anything more than a very, very warm glob, which, you know, it'll still screw up infantry, certainly, but it's not going to be killing a Titan anytime soon, I'm afraid. So this weapon is primarily used in relatively close-quarter situations like urban combat or assault and fortified positions, where its weapon can be used both against enemy Titans and armoured vehicles, preferably Titans, because it's relatively slow firing. You don't really want to be wasting the shot on armoured vehicles, as your secondary weapon should probably be the one that's dedicated to dealing with relatively light threats. But additionally, of course, it is extremely effective against fortified positions like bunkers or even buildings. I mean, hit a building with something like this, and you're not going to have to worry about anyone occupying the building for a while, let's just say. And a bunker? Well, remember, this thing is so hot it explosively vaporizes tissue, so it hasn't got a whole lot of problem of heating up the place just a little bit. And speaking of fortifications, the Imperium have developed quite a few quite fascinating and highly specialized weapons for dealing with just that kind of scenario. One of which is the rather infamous Quake Cannon. The Quake Cannon, seen here mounted on a Bane Sword super heavy tank for a little bit of scale, is a very interesting little weapon because, you see, it is not just a mundane gun. It doesn't just fire a very large, high explosive round or anything. No. This one's a far more interesting little thing. You see, when the Imperium undergoes the ultimate sanction of Exterminatus, the destruction of a planet, this has quite a few consequences beyond the merely mundane. The planet explodes, of course, but in the 41st millennium, where the warp is a thing, this causes rather considerable effects beyond the merely mundane. It has an effect on the warp around it. The death cry of the planet, essentially, potentially millions, if not billions of people, is a quite extreme thing, to say the least. And this effect on the warp can be measured and harnessed in the material universe using some rather arcane technology. The tech priests and magos geologists from the Adaptors Mechanicus are dispatched to any sector in which an exterminatus is going to be carried out, and using some extremely specialized machinery, equipment, sensors, and all manners of nonsense, they somehow manage to harness this death cry of a planet, so to say, into a physical form. Now, if you want to ask me how they do this, I haven't the faintest. Warhammer 40k usually does a pretty damn good job of explaining how shit works, but in this case we're just going to have to wave it away with the good old it's just fluff. Excuse, I'm afraid. No fantasy license can be completely perfect after all, but the cool factor might just justify it, considering that these shells are now imbued with the death cry of a planet, which means that when one of these shells is fired and hits something, it essentially hits with the force of a planet-cracking projectile, causing a psychic shockwave in the nearby area, which has some rather uncomfortable effects on the real world. In fact, this weapon is known to be able to crack pretty much any defenses. It is known to destroy curtain walls in a single hit, and it is an extremely specialized weapon for that very reason. It has occasionally been mounted on Emperor-class Titans and even supposedly on Warlords, but the biggest problem with the weapon is not its effectiveness, but the simple fact there's not a whole lot of ammunition for it, as the ammunition requires somewhat special manufacturing processes, as I think you have probably realized at this point, so they're quite scarce, but when they are brought to battle, well, they're quite bloody effective. Sadly, however, the weapon does have a few drawbacks. You see, the shells are essentially imbued with the souls of the dead and the damned, not to mention the so-called spirit of the dead planet. This causes the shells to scream and wail, which, as you might imagine, might make the crew just a tiny bit nervous occasionally, like, "Captain, the ammunition is screaming at me, what should I do?" Just ignore it, it'll go away as soon as we fire it. So yeah, that's a slight drawback. Additionally, it is not a particularly accurate weapon, which, well, let's just say that if you miss the target with this thing and end up hitting anywhere even remotely close to allied troops, the consequences could potentially be somewhat, well, disastrous. And so it is almost only ever used against fixed fortifications of considerable size. It might be very, very tempting to try and lob this giant globulate of absolute and completely condensed fuck you against something like a Titan, but, well, the odds are you're not going to be hitting it, and the resulting shockwaves of it detonating somewhere in the distance is likely to alert the Titan that it's getting shot at by something capable of making the fucking ground shake, which the Titan usually takes umbrage to, so the crew had best be damn sure that they're not going to be missing the first shells, all I'm saying. And then we get to our second true Titan killer, the Volcano Cannon. It was given this somewhat ominous sounding name due to the fact that when it hits something, it has a nasty tendency of turning the very rock around the area it hits into molten magma. It is essentially a las weapon, except again the metaphor about rabbits and bears come to mind, and it operates from a somewhat interesting source, shall we say. The flawless crystals used inside the weapon's magnifying lenses can only be created from a specialized mineral vein that lies beneath the lava rivers on Cinderus. And the origin story for this one is a little bit interesting. You see, the Magos geologist of the planet says that several thousand heretic psykers were slaughtered and buried on the planet for attempting to take part in a treacherous plot to kill the local planetary governor. Their remains had apparently been compressed unusually quickly by the shifting geological structures of the planet and combined with the natural elements present beneath the lava to form a unique crystalline mineral. So, dead heretics make really, really good glasses, it would appear, which is nice for the Empire because it's a very large gun. And it is also one of relatively few weapons to have been developed by the Mechanicus post-Horus Heresy. In fact, the first stable and officially sanctioned model of the Volcano Cannon is the Phaeton pattern, which was perfected by mid-millennia 35. The previous versions, while being quite devastating, had a nasty tendency of exploding catastrophically and taking the entire Titan with it, if you were, lucky. If you were unlucky, it would take a considerable part of the fucking planet with it, so, they didn't really want to mount those on normal Titans because that seemed like a very poor trade. The current version of the Volcano Cannon is relatively reliable, however, and doesn't blow up all that often. It does, however, require an absolutely gargantuan amount of energy to be charged and fired properly, which means it is a primary Titan class weapon. It is occasionally also mounted on Imperial Super Heavy tanks known as Shadow Swords. The problem with this is that it requires the entirety of the Shadow Sword's energy output, including its engines, and even then it needs to be charged for about a minute or so before it can actually fire, so all the Shadow Sword's internal mechanisms must be shut down. It can only run on the very basics of life support and targeting mechanisms, and nothing else. And of course, once fired, it will drain the Shadow Sword's batteries almost completely, leaving it stationary and virtually defenseless for several precious minutes after firing. So, again, much like the Quake Cannon, you'd best not be messing with this thing. A Titan, however, is able to provide the vast amount of energy needed to fire the weapon with far less drawbacks, although it can only be mounted on Warlord class Titans and up. Reavers and Warhounds simply do not have the energy output to be capable of operating this weapon. But on the other hand, the trade-off is certainly worth it, as a single hit from this Volcano Cannon is more than capable of crippling Titans, and, well, firing this thing against tanks is just downright unfair. It would be like hitting puppies with a burning hockey stick. You just don't do it. It's mean. It's just... you don't. It's cruel and unusual, that's what it is. But Titans, oh, those suckers are asking for it. But that's not all. No, we have yet one more Titan-killing weaponry to look at. The Plasma Annihilator. This is, hands down, the largest plasma weapon to be carried by anything that is capable of traversing a planet. It is only carried by Emperor-class Titans and delivers sufficient firepower to be considered not only a Titan killer, but a city killer. A hit from this thing is enough to devastate armies. Firing this at something like a Hive is likely to burn the whole thing to the ground, really. And the best part is, despite the fact that this is a plasma weapon, highly advanced and highly old technology allows it to be fired rapidly, which lets the Emperor Titan's Prncipe cover a large swath of ground in burning plasma, which is a pretty damn effective way of killing off whatever might be in the area. Additionally, it is one of the few weapons that do not necessarily need a secondary weapon to knock out Voyage shields. The sheer weight of firepower that the Plasma Annihilator is capable of pumping out is capable of overloading Voyage shields and destroying whatever is behind them. Due to this high rate of fire, the weapon is, however, quite energy hungry, let's just say. Only an Emperor class could possibly operate the weapon, and even then, it's only got enough energy from its multiple plasma reactors to be operating one of them, while in contrast it could potentially operate 6 Volcano Cannons, so yeah, think on that one for a while. It is a rather wonderful weapon indeed, and it's quite rare. Emperor Titans are not everyday occurrences, and as such, these massive and lovely little weapons are sadly quite rare as well, which is a downright tragedy if you ask me. But even that is not the most devastating weapon available to the Titans. Yes, there is one thing that is even crazier, namely the Vortex missile. You see, this missile carries a specialized warhead known as the Vortex warhead. This is an extremely ancient piece of archaeotech, and the Mechanicum doesn't really understand how it works themselves, but that is not going to stop them from firing it at people. After all, this is the organization that gave us the lovely quote, "Take care with that, we have not fully ascertained its function, and the ticking is accelerating." Attributed to technographer Adar Mills, right before the horrible explosion. But enough beating of the bushes. So, I hear you ask, what is so fearsome then about this particular black dingly-dong? Well, the difference, of course, is in the payload. Oh, and yes, I know, that's what she said. You see, it carries no mere explosive device. It essentially carries a warp drive inside of it, and when it detonates, it opens a rift into the warp in real space, which utterly and completely annihilates anything caught in its area of effect. Not by blowing them up or disintegrating them or melting them or anything, but by literally pulling them straight into the warp itself. There is no defending against a Vortex warhead. There is no void shields that are going to be protecting you, there are no armor plating that is going to be protecting you. No bunker is strong enough, no hole is deep enough. If this thing hits you, you're not going to be in this universe any longer. Now, as you might imagine, this is a rather devastating piece of kit. Yes, I know. And this is weighed up somewhat by the fact that this weapon is beyond rare. It is only brought out for the most extreme of situations. For example, when there is a chance to kill off an enemy champion of extreme renown. For example, there was an attempt to kill Abaddon with such a weapon, the leader of the Black Crusade, who, well, Games Workshop keeps trying to convince us that he's an actual credible threat, but, well, there's a reason why the 40k community has dubbed him Failbadon the Harmless. So, yeah, there's that. Or it might be used against particularly heavily fortified enemy positions that the Imperium, doesn't need after they're done with it, and therefore wouldn't mind if it all gets sucked into a giant black hole that leads directly into the realms of the goddamn Chaos Gods. Additionally, the weapon has a slight drawback. You see, once the rift in real space has been torn, there's no controlling it. You can't just shut it off if it turns out to be a bit of an impediment, and it moves. You see, it will try to feed on nearby sources of warp energy, and these warp currents are almost impossible to predict before firing the weapon, so After firing this weapon into the enemy's mists and seeing half of them disappear into a giant black hole, that giant black hole might suddenly turn around and start heading towards your guys, which, you know, it could potentially induce just the tiniest hints of panic amongst your troops, but hey, at least that would be better than having half of them eaten by the gods, so, you know, silver lining. And that has been it for the Battle Titan weaponry. Now, there are some subcategories, as I mentioned. Within these subcategories would be the Apocalypse Missile Launcher, which some would argue to be a proper Titan weaponry, which is essentially just a massive missile launcher, usually mounted on the back of Reaver-class Titans, and sometimes also carried as secondary weapons on larger Titans. This is essentially a very large missile launcher, primarily used for the suppression of infantry or armoured vehicles, etc., and I would probably classify it as a support weapons, and there are an absolute ton of these. For example, a Carapace mounted landing pad for example, Space Marines to land their Thunderhawks on and then use them as a jumping off point to assault the enemy, having used the Titan's Voyage shields to get closer, or perhaps even just carrying squads of Assault Marines. There's Carapace mounted multi-lasers for anti-aircraft protection, for example, often employed by the larger Titans, seeing as their proper Titan weaponry, of course, aren't particularly effective at shooting down aircraft. There are assault by the Titan, and then are effectively fired from an altered Titan arm. In essence, it could be said that it is a massive boarding torpedo fitted to a Battle Titan's arms. For example, it would wander up to a fortress, punch the wall, and disgorge Space Marines inside the midst of the fortress, for example. There's the Deathstrike Cannon, which is a Starship-grade macro cannon fitted on Warlord-class Battle Titans, which is beyond rare, let's just say. I think there's only mentions I've heard of it. It was in a White Dwarf copy. And it was old too, so whether or not it's even canon still, I don't actually know. There's even an upgrade that is literally just a devotional bell on top of the Titan, which produces, you know, a morale-enhancing effect, since it's essentially a shrine to the God Emperor. Potentially there could be a fire control center up there, for example. Or the Psi Pulse, for example, for the more rare Psi Titans. Or, of course, there might even be extra heads. Some Chaos Titans have multiple heads. Hell, there could also, of course, be light support weaponries like barrage missiles, other types of high-explosive anti-tank missiles. Some even use harpoons. Now, this has been specifically used by Warhound Titans during the Horsehair and later on Chaos Titans. What this essentially is a massive-ass harpoon that takes up one of the weapons of the Titan, usually used on Warhounds, and is used exactly like a harpoon. It spears an enemy Titan, using the relative low energy and velocity of the weapon to pierce its void shields without detonating them, and then hook the Titan and drag it down. This way, multiple Warlords, Warhound Titans could, for example, potentially even, and in fact it did happen in the Horus Heresy novels, they disabled an Emperor-class Titan by essentially just tying it down. They fired multiple harpoons into its weapons, and therefore rendered it essentially defenseless, and then overran it with Adeptus Astartes Legionaries afterwards. There's all kinds of other stuff to it, support weapons. There are melee weapons for Titans, because of course there are, like battering rams, chain fists, power swords, energy whips, more specific chaos weapons, like the Doom Fist, for example, which is essentially a greater demon of Khorne that's been captured inside a gigantic fist. And yes, that is about as cool as it sounds, but if I was to cover all of them, this video would never end, so I'll leave a link in the description to a wonderful page that summarizes a lot of these weapons, in case you want to read on a little bit by yourself. So, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.